WWF Rage in the Cage for the Sega Mega CD is the latest game I'll be looking at in my Slam Jam wrestling game retrospective, and was by far the most ambitious and exciting wrestling game to come to consoles in its era. Utilizing the power of the Sega CD, it featured more wrestlers than any console wrestling game before it, and was the first wrestling game that featured a big roster, an actual video, and a bunch of voice clips from the WWF. So, without further ado, let's get ready to rumble once again, but this time with WWF Rage in the Cage. When wrestling games moved from the era of the NES and onto the 16-bit generation of consoles, the leap in what they could offer was huge. Sure, the arcades had the likes of WrestleFest and WrestleWar, and those were obviously much more advanced than what you could get on the likes of the NES. But for things that you could play in your home, the arrival of the Sega Mega Drive and Super Nintendo meant a new era of possibility. First there was Super WrestleMania, and then there was WWF Royal Rumble. But after this, there was WWF Rage in the Cage on the Sega Mega Drive CD. There would later be WWF Raw as the final game in this chain of releases, but whilst that game had the advantage of being the latest release, and therefore had all of the benefits of the games that came before, it didn't have the power of the Mega CD behind it, with the extra storage space that CDs allowed. Whilst Super WrestleMania had 8 wrestlers on the Mega Drive and 10 on the Super Nintendo, the Royal Rumble game would have 12 wrestlers apiece on the different versions. I remember when I first then saw the advert for WWF Rage in the Cage, and it showed a huge roster of 20 wrestlers that would be featured in the game. This was by far the largest number of wrestlers in a WWF game by this point, and wouldn't be beaten until WWF Attitude on the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 in 1999. The wrestlers included in this game were, get ready, deep breath, Bret the Hitman Hart, Brian Knobbs and Jerry Saggs of the Nasty Boys, Crush, the Narcissist, or Narcissus, Lex Luger, Macho Man Randy Savage, Samu and Fatu, also known as the Headshrinkers, and yes, that is Fatu, who would later be renamed Rikishi Fatu with a PH, because having a PH instead of an F is cool. And yes, that is the same Rikishi who is the father of Jimmy and Jay Uso and Solo Sikoa. Then there was Yokozuna, who is also a relative of Rikishi, the Ugandan giant Kamala, the Undertaker, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, Mr. Perfect, IRS Owen R. Shyster, who is the father of Bray Wyatt, Bam Bam Bigelow, the model Rick Martel, the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, the Big Boss Man, and Razor Ramon. Oh, and Tatanka. Huge roster for the time. The game also features Howard Finkel doing the ring introductions, and he appears in the ring and features actual voice clips of the Fink announcing the wrestlers.
The following contest, scheduled for one fall, will take place inside of the steel cage. To my left, from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, weighing 234 pounds, Bret Hitman Hart.
This was beyond impressive for the time, and a sign of the benefit of the game being on a CD to hold the extra space for audio clips. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about the music in the game. The character select screen allows you to hear the entrance themes for all of the roster in the game, and is disappointing that the wrestlers' themes are the same MIDI tunes that were used on the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive games. I mean, you do hear the Native American call, I suppose you'd call it, at the beginning of Tatanka's, which is a voice clip, but even that then cuts into the MIDI theme. It would have been awesome if the game had featured full-length actual CD quality recordings of the wrestlers' themes. Now, I believe I'm correct in saying that we wouldn't get actual audio clips of the wrestlers' themes until WWF WrestleMania the arcade game, but correct me if I'm wrong. In fact, there might have been some actual audio on the WWF European Rampage game on the Amiga. I need to double check that, might make that video next. The game also includes that the wrestlers will say something after their ring introductions and before the actual match starts, and again this uses actual clips of the wrestlers' voices.
You may have wrestled all the rest, but now it's time to wrestle the best, the Hitman.
To my right, from San Antonio, Texas, weighing 240 pounds, Shawn Michaels.
Aside from being the sexiest man alive, I am also the greatest champion that WWF has ever seen.
This is another cool way that the CD technology was used to enhance the game. It's a shame to say that the game doesn't feature full commentary, and again, this wouldn't be introduced until WrestleMania the arcade game. The other major way the Mega CD is used is by including several video clips in the game from actual WWF footage. Now, the footage is black and white and low res and small on the screen, but it's still a cool inclusion. You get the footage as an intro to the game, but then you can also access more footage from the character select screen. You can choose to watch a clip of each wrestler's finishing move. And just watching some of this, it's so weird to see that this came from a time when Shawn Michaels' finisher was being promoted as some boring side suplex instead of his super kick known as Sweet Chin Music. The actual gameplay is pretty much exactly the same as WWF Royal Rumble on the Mega Drive does. You can either play with a 3 or 6 button controller, and whilst the 6 button version is better, the game is still very playable with 3 buttons on the original Mega Drive gamepad. You just have to press 2 buttons together to pin and such like. The 16-bit era of games allowed you to do more moves than what you could on the NES, and you could of course do punch, kick, run as separate buttons, and then you could walk up to your opponent and initiate a grapple. Doing this, you then have to mash buttons in a kind of tug of war, and this is definitely better than the waggle the joystick method that we had seen on WrestleMania for the Amiga, which I looked at in a previous video. Now, depending what button you're mashing, you'll pull off different moves like vertical suplexes, or headbutts, or body slams, and a bunch more. It's not got the same level of moves that you'd get in modern wrestling games, but there are still plenty of different moves in there. One problem though is that in this era, pretty much all of the wrestlers did the same moves. It wouldn't be until WWF Raw where we start to vary things up a bit more. Now, the game is fun to play, although the battle to win grapples can be a real pain if you're on a normal or challenging difficulty level. This can be scaled from like 1 is very easy and then it's 9 or 10 to be the most difficult, and I found the game basically impossible to play at the harder settings. The game allows you to do singles matches that can be straight one-on-one matches, brawl matches which are no count out, no DQ, and the only way to win the match is to get rid of all of your opponent's energy. This means the matches can actually run shorter than regular matches, as in those matches you still have to get the pin even if your opponent has no energy left. And likewise, if you have no energy left, you still have the opportunity for a big comeback if you're losing, and then you can somehow pull off a win. In this, it's just if you lose all the energy, then you lose, like on Street Fighter. There is then Tournament Mode, which I guess is the main mode on the game, where you go through a string of opponents to become the WWF Champion. Now, this being WWF Rage in the Cage, the main draw to getting this game would be the inclusion of the steel cage matches. And excitingly, for nostalgia's sake, the game has the big old style blue WWF cages. These matches are won by climbing to the top rope and then climbing over the cage to escape. You can't really do much with the cage, and there's not anything to replicate the excitement of actual cage matches with both you and your opponent being on the cage at the same time and continuing to fight and punch each other. It's simply that whoever climbs first will win. There's not even a door for you to escape from. So the real tension is that you need to keep the other guy from being able to climb. So it is basically just like the no DQ match, but instead of going for the pin, you just have to climb up to the top rope and then hope that you are able to get out of there before your opponent can stop you. So the game isn't as fleshed out as WWF Raw, although that game didn't have the cage match or as large a roster. I've always wanted a combined game of all of this era's WWE games. Super WrestleMania had different graphics that are similar but not quite the same as the others, so they may not gel, but WWF Royal Rumble, Rage in the Cage and WWF Raw all had basically the same graphical style. Add all of these rosters together, and that there are two versions of the Royal Rumble game with slightly different rosters, and then you would have a fantastic ROM hack. Imagine all of them combined. This might actually exist. I'll have to check it out someday. Now, as I didn't have a Mega CD for some time, this was the one game that I always wanted but eluded me for years. By the time I'd got it, I had by far moved on to the era of N64 and PS1 early 3D wrestling games, so whilst it was cool to have, it didn't have the same impressiveness as it would have done if I'd played it when it first came out. Look, it has a reasonable amount of content in terms of wrestlers, and playing through all the tournaments to see their ending clips will take you a while. The gameplay will get repetitive before you've gone through the tournaments as everyone though, but it was from an era where wrestling games started to become more playable, so if you are really into it, I can imagine you would play through as every single person. I like going back to this game as it has a somewhat unique roster with the likes of the Headshrinkers and Big Boss Man, Kamala, and people that weren't necessarily on WWF Raw. This game also features the bad guy version of Lex Luger, even though he'd become a face a few months before its release, and it had Crush with the dyed hair. It's a shame that the game doesn't feature tag team matches, and it's a bit weird considering that the Headshrinkers, Money Incorporated, and the Nasty Boys were all on the game as tag teams. Now, I have enjoyed diving back into this, and as part of this retrospective, I expect that it won't be long before I get to Super WrestleMania, WWF Raw, and of course Royal Rumble, as well as all of the other ones out there. So let me know what you think of WWF Rage in the Cage in the comments. Did you play this game or any of its contemporaries from the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive era? What game would you like to see me cover next? So with that, I will once again remind you to check out www.xstreamed.tv/gaming for the written article version of today's discussion, as well as xstream.tv/wrestling for a bunch of wrestling related articles, and you can check out our Slam Jam wrestling show on its own separate channel. Make sure you smash that subscribe button here on the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel, and with that, until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom. And we're off the air.